What you're about to watch is a supercut of all of the product spotlights we've done on the RetroN products from our homies over at Hyperkin. The purpose is to put all of this information in one place for you guys with chapters so you can navigate through it all, so you can determine which one of these clone consoles is right for you. These videos are all presented in the original form that I made them in however many months ago. I haven't made too many edits except removing, like, subscribe, support our Redbubble, stuff like that, so I didn't sound too redundant in this already long video. All of these are sort of presented in descending order from the RetroN 5 all the way down to like the RetroN 1 and the RetroN 77. Some of these videos are pretty old in comparison to others, so the quality is varying. All of these are available in our store, Nostalgic Video Games in Florence, Kentucky, and we are currently working on an online store where you can purchase everything we have in store online from the comfort of your own home. It's going to be a long, arduous journey through all the inventory, but I will absolutely update you guys when that online store is up. So without further ado, here we go. There are so many awesome systems, all with unique and fantastic games. It's like children. It's impossible to pick your favorite, despite them being an absolute mess. Chances are, if you're a collector, behind your TV is a Lovecraftian nightmare hellscape void of power cables, AV cords, HDMIs, converter boxes, RF switches, power strips, sensor bars, and whatever the hell that is. If only there was a way to condense this into a state that you would be comfortable showing your mother. That's where our good friends at Hyperkin come in. The RetroN 5 is a clone emulator system that plays NES, SNES, Genesis, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance, as well as all of their Japanese counterparts, all on one system. You heard me right. One system, one HDMI cable, one power cord, 9 systems. 12 if you get a converter peripheral. The RetroN 5 has been around since 2014 in one form or another, performing miracle exorcisms on your entertainment centers, but is it still worth spending the $200 on today? This is the recent Hyper Beach Special Edition that comes in this gorgeous teal and pink color scheme, as well as with an additional Hyperkin Scout SNES clone controller, also in that same color scheme. In the box you get the console, the RetroN controller, the Scout, power cord as well as international adapters, HDMI cable, and a micro USB to charge the RetroN controller, as well as your manuals and a Hyperkin logo sticker. In 2022, the design of the RetroN 5 seems a little out of date with their more recent design language. A lot of their newer consoles have undergone design overhauls, making things blockier, simpler, and adding a little chopped corner with a light-up Hyperkin logo. This special edition would have been a great opportunity to revisit the design of this console and homogenize it with the rest of the RetroN lineup. But overall, the console looks pretty sleek. Along the top of the console, you have the ports for all of your different cartridges, along with the Game Boy port at the front. Along each side, you have controller ports for the NES, SNES, and Genesis controllers. These work with both Hyperkin's clone controllers like the Scout, as well as OEM controllers and other third-party options. At the back of the console, you have all of your outputs for video and power, a USB port, as well as an SD card slot. This allows you to install language patches for Japanese Famicom and Super Famicom games. It's a great option, considering some very expensive and sought-after NTSC games' Japanese counterparts are significantly cheaper. This way, you're still playing on original hardware. Upon startup, the console greets you with a startup screen, then boots you into the RetroN 5's menu. This lists all the possible systems as well as settings. Make sure you don't insert more than one cartridge at a time, because this will confuse the RetroN and it will yell at you until you take the cartridges out and restart the system. A little annoying, but ultimately nothing more than a minor nitpick. One of the great advantages to playing on the RetroN 5 is the built-in save states. When in-game, press down and start on your controller to access the in-game menu. From here, you can save your game, which is particularly handy for those rather difficult games with no save feature, or save features that require you to enter a password or complete a vampire-themed Sudoku puzzle. You can also add different filters from this in-game menu as well. It's always nice to have options on the visuals. Sometimes you just miss those scan lines. You can also add pixel smoothing, which I usually don't prefer on most consoles, but with something like the Game Gear, using that peripheral, it really does benefit on a large blown-up screen to smooth those pixels out. That brings us to the visuals of the console. The RetroN 5 is full HD hardware, meaning it outputs in HD instead of upscaling. This will get you the best visuals out of your original cartridges, compared to HDMI converters plugged into original consoles. Those just upscale the original AV or RF video feed. Here, we get to see those gorgeous pixels in full glorious 720p. Besides the save states and visual filters, RetroN 5 really doesn't do much different from your original consoles. You may think it a bit superfluous to spend another $200 on a console that just plays games for consoles you already own. But these quality of life changes, in my opinion, more than justify the price tag. When I moved into my apartment for college, I bought my RetroN 5, mostly for the convenience of not having that. However, I found that my favorite thing about this console is the save states. It makes jumping back into a game much easier than before. That, paired with being able to play my Game Boy Advance games on my TV, yeah, take my money. Despite being almost 8 years old, the RetroN 5 is still going strong. The packaging proudly promotes the highest cartridge compatibility of any console on the market, which is definitely true. The biggest stinker with this product, though, is the RetroN controller. The only positive things I can say about this monstrosity is that it's wireless. It has a home button, so you don't have to use the shortcut like with the other controllers. Neither of those things make up for the terrible form factor and overall cheap feel. Hyperkin is usually great at making their third-party controllers and consoles feel premium, but the buttons on this thing are either touchy and clickety or sticky and gummy. The plastic feels cheap, and overall it's just the opposite of ergonomic. Thankfully, this release comes with the Hyperkin Scout, which is my favorite SNES clone controller. Looks great, feels great, and honestly you might as well throw away the loaf of bread anyways. Overall, the RetroN 5 is a great system with tons of fantastic quality of life improvements that will transform your retro gaming setup from a nest of devil's snare to a clean and wife-approved area. Mostly. Clone consoles are a staple in the retro gaming community. Love them or hate them, they're here to stay. Nothing will ever beat playing on an original system, but if you have an NES, I guarantee you've got some weird problems. You gotta finagle the cartridge in there, you gotta pull it out with a wrench, or you've had it repaired once, maybe twice, multiple times. And how many systems do you have cluttering your shelf? Do you look like this? That is an insane amount of cables that you've got to manage. Clone consoles are cheaper alternatives that offer a lot of quality of life improvements over playing on original hardware. And one of the most appealing features that these clone consoles offer is multi-cart compatibility, the most infamous of which being the RetroN 5. This puppy plays NES, SNES, Genesis. This puppy plays Famicom, NES, SNES, Genesis, Super Famicom, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games on one console with one HDMI cord. But today we're focusing on the Classic 3. Classic Q3? I don't know how to say it. I've always said Classic Q, but I think it's supposed to be Classic. I don't know. This puppy is a brand new clone console from Old School that plays NES, SNES, and Genesis games, all in 720p HD. We'll be comparing it to Hyperkin's equivalent, the RetroN 3, which plays all the same games and serves the same exact purpose on your shelf. So I'm going to try and answer the question which one you should buy. This video was not sponsored by Old School or Hyperkin. We did not receive these consoles for free, and we have purchased them ourselves wholesale for sale in our store, Nostalgic Video Games. Both of these consoles are currently available for purchase in our store and on the company's websites. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So right off the bat, the Classic Q3's box is much bigger than the RetroN 3, proudly touting that HD 720p, an aspect ratio and region switches, 2 controllers, AV and HD output, and cartridge compatibility. Boxes on both of these are pretty standard. They show off the products and give you a little rundown of what to expect. Once you get both of these out of the box is when you really start seeing the differences settle in. The Classic Q3 has this sort of hybridization of the Super Nintendo and Genesis designs. Kinda neat, kinda weird. The RetroN 3 continues Hyperkin's sort of design language here with this simplistic geometric box look with one cut edge with the Hyperkin logo and these little ridges along the top. But in the end, visuals are really just down to personal preference. I really like the colors and the translucent plastic of the RetroN 3 HD. I really miss when companies would just mold everything in translucent plastic. If I look at something and my brain tells me that I can eat it, it makes me want to buy it that much more. But I do think there is a lot of merit to the artistic design of Classic Q3s. It has the sort of Super Nintendo raised ridges here with the power and reset buttons, but then has the Genesis Model 1 look with the big old round spot where you stick the cartridges in. I appreciate the color coding, but I don't know how I feel about the big primary swaths of red, purple, and blue. It doesn't speak to me quite as much, whereas the RetroN 3 is a bit more cohesive. But one of the biggest, most important differences to me about these two systems is the location of the controller ports. The Classic Q3 has all NES, SNES, and Genesis controller ports all along the front here. That is fantastic. It is a little cramped, so you might not be able to have all of them plugged in at the same time, but that shouldn't really be an issue with the way that they're ordered. The RetroN 3 tackles this a bit differently.
We've got 2 Super Nintendo ports on the front, 2 Genesis ports on the right, and the NES ports on the left. That's one of my biggest complaints with a lot of Hyperkin's newer consoles, especially the RetroN 5. Having all the controller ports along the side is really inconvenient. I know a lot of people, myself included, have those IKEA block shelves that have all of our consoles nice and spaced out on them. So if you set this on a bookshelf or a shelf that's sectioned off into cubes, I know the shelf that I have my RetroN sitting on is just barely enough space on each side for clearance. So when you plug your controller in on the side, you bend the crap out of the cable right where it connects to the port. And that really stresses those cables and has me concerned for the longevity of the controllers I use. One of the biggest appeals to me about clone consoles is that these are new hardware. You don't have to worry about putting the wear and tear on an original console or controller. So when there's something like that that seems to compromise the longevity of the console and the accessories, that really irks me. So I definitely think that the Classic U3 handled the controller ports much better. Comparing the power and reset buttons, the Classic U3 works just like the Super Nintendo. It's a little slide switch, but it has 4 notches: off, Genesis, Super Nintendo, and NES. Now why they didn't make the lights and labels line up with the arrow and the switch really just bugs me. It doesn't affect the usability or anything, it just annoys the shit out of me. Reset button sits right here. They got these big chunky buttons. On the RetroN 3, you have these smaller power and reset buttons. I like the homage to the Super Nintendo with the Classic U, but these RetroN 3 buttons do feel a little better, even if they are smaller and more inset. The RetroN 3 also has a separate switch to choose between NES, Genesis, and Super Nintendo, instead of that being incorporated with the power switch. Both ways work, doesn't really bother me, really up to personal preference there. Now the back of the consoles is where some really interesting differences appear. Both of these have AV and HD ports, which is fantastic, especially if you have multiple consoles set up and don't want to swap cables around, so you can choose which format you use. Both of these use a micro USB cable for power, which I prefer USB-C because those cables don't wear out nearly as much, but I guess micro USB is cheaper. I don't know. And they both have 16:9 and 4:3 aspect ratio switches. That's nice if you are wrong and prefer to stretch your games. That's just me. But that's great that it's built into these consoles, so you have the option. Now the Classic Q3 also has an LED switch, a U and J switch, and a P and N switch. The LED here that circles around the entire console. It's a really nice touch, and it's fantastic that you have the switch. Sometimes if I'm playing in the dark, those lighting effects can really bug me and end up being really distracting. So I'm glad that that is built in. Though I do think I prefer the simplicity and class that just the one lit up Hyperkin corner adds. Yeah, the big long bar is cool, but really is it necessary? Now these U, J, P, and N switches are for specific Genesis regions. You've got United States, Japan, and you've got PAL and NTSC. For the Super Nintendo and NES, you've got this switch back here on the bottom of the console for PAL and NTSC. It's really weird. I don't know why it's on the bottom of the console. That's really weird. Because if you have a collection that has cartridges from multiple different regions, every time you're gonna have to pick up your console and flip that switch when you wanna play a different cartridge. It's weird, I don't know why that wasn't included on the back, just something to point out. It's even worse on the RetroN 3. There are 3 switches on the bottom of the console. I don't know if it's just because of it was cheaper to produce the boards that way or what. That's just really inconvenient design. The switches on the RetroN 3 are nicer, they're inset, and they feel really good. The Classic Q3 switches are kind of these small rounded ones. They're, you know, my fingers kind of slip around on them. I don't like those switches as much, but it's nice that you have most of those region switches on the back of the console instead of on the bottom. Now the last major difference I want to point out is the depth of these cartridge slots. So on the Classic Q3, the NES cartridge fits down a little bit past the label. It covers up a little bit of that art. But it's nice that this doesn't have a death grip. A lot of these clone consoles and replacement pins are really tight, which usually Hyperkin has a pretty bad issue with. But I'm happy to say that the RetroN 3 isn't nearly as bad as some of the other consoles. The one difference being that you really kind of have to get it just right and add some intense pressure to get that down there. Feels kind of sketchy. I hate doing that, especially if you've got like a copy of Earthbound or something that you're just jamming in there. Kind of concerning. The Classic Q3, it slots in a whole lot easier, it holds it tight, but it comes out. Isn't that hard? The Super Nintendo slot fits in a little better. The only thing I'm worried about is that with the NES cartridges, if your label's a little peely, you can wear out that label a little bit on that edge. Whereas with the RetroN, it isn't even close to hitting that label. So that's pretty much it going over the aesthetics and physical features of these consoles. The one big thing that separates these, in my opinion, is plastic quality. Hyperkin does a really good job at making their consoles and controllers feel premium. This feels like a console. The Classic Q3 kind of feels like a plastic box with a motherboard in it. It's not that the plastic quality on this thing is bad. To me, I think it comes down to texture. This matte black has this weird kind of texture to it, and it shows fingerprints and little blemishes a whole lot more than I expected it to. Whereas the RetroN 3, the translucent but smoother matte, doesn't really show all that much. I don't think either of these consoles' shells will bust or break on you, but it is worth noting that the RetroN 3 feels a little better. It's also worth noting that the RetroN 3's MSRP is $10 more. In the end, not all that much, but it does kind of end up feeling a little more premium. The next thing I want to talk about is the controllers. Both of these consoles come with 2 controllers. I love that. Most people who buy these consoles are gonna want to play with friends, family, or kids, so having them come with 2 controllers is fantastic. Hyperkin opts to give you their versions of the Super Nintendo and Genesis controllers, the Scout and Squire. If you've watched some of our other videos, you'll know that I really like the Scout. Hyperkin controllers always have great build quality, and the buttons feel fantastic. Both of these also update the classic designs to homogenize them with Hyperkin's art language. You got these ridges, and you got these nice geometric shapes. They look nice, they feel great, and they play great. Old School decided to make an entirely new controller for the Classic Q3, and it's weird. Looking at it, you can tell that it's sort of this weird hybrid of the Super Nintendo and Genesis 6-button controllers, but with the more modern controller prongs down at the end for added comfort. Holding this thing feels odd. I've got big hands, and these are just a little too small. The prongs don't come out quite far enough, and I feel like I have to hold my wrists at a weird sharp angle. And these buttons are just slightly too close together. I don't know. I'm not entirely sold on this thing. You've got your D-pad, your shoulder buttons, your A, B, C, and X, Y, Z, as well as start and select. You've got everything you need, but these buttons feel a lot more clickety than the nice smooth Hyperkin controllers. They also use the Super Nintendo port, and they have a switch on the back of the console to switch between Nintendo and Sega. In the end, I think the thought and intention is well placed and it's there, but the delivery just kind of falls flat for me. They're serviceable, you'll be able to control your games with them, they're just not for me. But the cool thing about both of these consoles is that you can use any third-party controller or any OEM controller in those ports. So if you don't like it, you don't have to use it. In the controller category, I definitely have to give it to Hyperkin. Yeah, if you want to play 2-player Genesis games, you're going to have to go out and get another Squire or Genesis controller. Same goes for Super Nintendo. But it's still nice to get new, modern updates that still feel classic for these controllers. So the point definitely goes to Hyperkin here.
So here we've got the Classic Q3 and the RetroN 3 all fired up playing Super Mario Bros. And as you can see, the Classic Q3 on the left is quite a bit more saturated. The colors are really bright and vibrant. It doesn't look bad, it's just a little weird. The RetroN feels a bit more right to me, but there's still just some like weird things. I don't know if it was the way that the capture card was working or whatnot, but there's that like one blue line along the bottom. I did want to note though that playing with the Classic Q3 controller felt a bit more floaty. It wasn't quite as responsive as the RetroN controllers. I was using the Scout here. So it was a bit interesting just feeling the different ways that these consoles and controllers actually control the games. Another thing you note is that there is a switch on the front of the Classic Q console that lets you switch between using the SNES port for all consoles or using the console-specific port that you gotta switch if you use that Classic Q controller on the Super Nintendo port or not. Now here's a comparison between the 4:3 and 16:9 aspect ratio switches on both consoles, as well as audio comparison. Now here's a comparison between a Super Nintendo game. We've got Donkey Kong Country 2. Now that saturation on the Classic Q3 continues here on the Super Nintendo port. It's a little more subtle here than it was in Super Mario Bros, but it is still noticeable. And I didn't really have any trouble with this game. I played for quite a while and had plenty of fun. This one seemed to control a bit better with the Classic Q3 controller than Super Mario Bros did.
I didn't really notice all too much of a difference. I don't know if that was just because this is actually a Super Nintendo game and using that Super Nintendo port or not. Just something to note. And last but not least here, we have Sonic the Hedgehog on the Sega Genesis. This one has the least differences I could spot. I think it is still just a bit more saturated, but it's not quite as easy to tell here. It's probably just because of how fast you're going in a Sonic game. The visuals both look great, the music sounded great on both systems, the audio on both of them seems just fine. In editing this video, I was able to tell that the RetroN was a bit louder than the classic Q3, but there really wasn't all that much of a difference in quality to me. Just with the nature of clone consoles, they'll never be 100% the exact same audio or visual quality as the original console or as each other. But despite the subtle differences that these two have, they both play and work great.
So that was the classic Q3 from Old School and the RetroN 3 from Hyperkin, and in the end, they're both really comparable systems. There are slight differences between the visuals and the sound. Just with hardware differences, these clone consoles are never going to be 100%. There's always going to be some incompatibilities, some weird little idiosyncrasies with the audio, some weird bugs. The classic Q does boast homebrew supports. It's definitely worth looking up your game specifically and seeing, because sometimes these clone consoles just don't do great with repros, multi-carts, and whatnot. So it's really on a case-by-case basis there. But every game I threw at these, they played just fine. I do want to say that the RetroN 3 played a little better, but honestly, that's down to the controllers. Both of these consoles are really comparable, and it's kind of a toss-up which one I think is best. I think some of the user-friendly design here, with all the ports on the front, is really a point in Classic Q's favor. The RetroN 3 does have nicer controllers, but both of them pretty much play the same. So it just comes down to personal preference. Personally, I like the RetroN. When it comes down to personal preference, it's really just aesthetics at that point, and I really like Hyperkin's design. So personally, I'd probably go with the RetroN 3, but both of these are fantastic budget options. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.
This is the RetroN 2 HD from Hyperkin. It's a 2-in-1 clone system that plays your NES and SNES cartridges. This is a fantastic budget option for a 2-in-1 console, and depending on where you get your used gaming consoles, can run you significantly less than an original Nintendo or an original Super Nintendo. But before we jump into the specifics, I just want to let you know that this console, as well as almost every other product we feature on this channel, is available in our store, Nostalgic Video Games in Florence, Kentucky. We are not sponsored by Hyperkin, nor did we receive this item for free. We purchased it ourselves as a distributor to sell in our store. The purpose of these videos are to give you a quick and helpful rundown of what you're getting when you buy one of these consoles. A lot of new third-party options really aren't on a lot of people's radar, and a lot of these companies don't do quite as much marketing as you'd expect. So I really like showing these products off and making sure you guys are well informed before choosing to spend your hard-earned money on them. We also have a Redbubble store down in the description with shirts and stickers and posters and hats, tons of cool stuff you can get some awesome designs for if you want to rep the channel. So with that out of the way, let's check out the console itself. So here is the RetroN 2 HD, and it fits perfectly into Hyperkin's design language. You've got this boxy appliance-looking machine with the one cut corner with the Hyperkin logo. And yep, it lights up when you turn the console on. This console is super evocative of the original Super Nintendo's design. Not just the color scheme, but the placement of the power and reset buttons as well. Here they are next to each other, for example. And they're also surprisingly comparable in size as well. I think the RetroN 2 is slightly smaller, but the Super Nintendo weighs a bit more. That being said, the RetroN 2 isn't light, nor does it feel cheap. Hyperkin does a fantastic job at making their consoles feel like game consoles and not just cheap plastic boxes with a motherboard in it. You've got nice high quality plastic with rubber feet on the bottom so it doesn't slide around anywhere. All of the switches feel fantastic and don't stick. Quick overview of everything that is on the console itself. You have your NES cartridge port as well as your Super Nintendo port. Now, unlike some other Hyperkin consoles and some other third-party consoles in general, these pins really aren't that much of a death grip. The cartridges go in, and they come out pretty easily. We currently have these in stock at Nostalgic from VGNY Soft, and this is probably one of the prettiest game cartridges I've ever seen. Go check out our video on that if you haven't already. Pop it in, pop it out. I always prefer to not feel like I'm breaking my cartridges when I'm putting them in and out of the system. The power switch is right here. The middle mode is off, up for NES, and down for Super Nintendo. Right across from it is the reset button.
And around the back, we have a 4:3 to 16:9 aspect ratio switch.
Just in case you prefer to play your retro games with them filling the entire screen. Personally, I don't like stretching those pixels, but it's always great to have options when playing. You also have an HDMI output. Now it is just a composite signal that is upscaled because that's how these games run, but it is great to have this HDMI output on the console, out of the box, plug it in and you play. But if you prefer your standard AV, they also have those outputs as well. And the last thing is a micro USB port for power. I usually prefer USB-C since they're a bit more sturdy, but this console was originally designed and came out before USB-C was really all over the place. So I'll give it a pass on that one. The last things are a couple switches on the bottom of the console. Now these are NTSC and PAL switches for both the NES and SNES. That means you can seamlessly play both your American and European cartridges on this console without any performance issues. On the front of the console you have all your controller ports, 2 NES ones in the middle and 2 Super Nintendo ones on the outside. Speaking of controllers, this console comes with 2 of them, and you know I love Hyperkin's controllers. You get both a Cadet and a Scout, both of which have 10-foot cables, which is awesome. Just like their consoles, Hyperkin does a great job at making their controllers feel premium. There are slight design changes to sort of homogenize it with Hyperkin's design language, but they still retain that classic feel. All of the buttons feel great, and I've never had a bad experience with a Hyperkin controller. It's awesome that you get 2, both the NES and SNES clone controllers, to play both types of games. Now it's cool that out of the box you can play some 2-player NES games by just using a Super Nintendo controller. But if you want to play some 2-player Super games, you're gonna have to get another SNES controller. But in the end, I'm always happy with Hyperkin's controllers, and it's always awesome to add another Scout and Cadet to my collection. These also work on original consoles and other clone systems, which is just awesome. Besides those, you get your micro USB cable, as well as a USB power adapter, which is awesome. I love when they include these. Your AV cables, and a standard 3-foot HDMI cable. You get everything you need to play this console out of the box, except the games. This console is designed to play your original cartridges, so it does not have games already preloaded onto it. Hyperkin also has a bunch of other RetroN systems, all at different price ranges, that play tons of different consoles. So if you really only care about the Nintendo and Super Nintendo, the RetroN 2 is the option for you. But if you want to also play Genesis games, maybe look into the RetroN 3. Or if you also want to add Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance on your TV to that equation, check out the RetroN 5. Now, unlike the RetroN 5, since these are not emulator consoles, they don't have any sort of menu or user interface. So you don't have any visual filters or language patch options like you do with the RetroN 5. But if you're just trying to get that nostalgic feel, the RetroN 2 will serve you nicely. Retro gaming, without a doubt, can be quite expensive, complicated, and these consoles are old. They crap out on you, they got some weird issues, or they just straight up don't work. And in the era of modern retro gaming, it's getting harder and harder to play your old consoles on newer TVs. That's where Hyperkin and RetroN come in. The RetroN 1 is an NES clone console that plays your original cartridges. Now these do not have games preloaded onto them, so these make great backups or alternatives to play games you already have in your collection if your console's a little on the decrepit side. Currently, Hyperkin has the RetroN 1 AV and HD, and that is exactly what it sounds like. This one has AV output, and this one has HD, which is very, very cool. Like I said earlier, it can be very, very difficult to get your old games running on modern TVs and looking and sounding good. Now there are tons of ways around this, and there are lots of clone consoles out there, but by far the most affordable is the RetroN. These RetroN ones are definitely aimed at a more casual audience. If you're looking for filters and save states and multi-cart compatibility, you'll want to look in their more higher-end consoles such as the RetroN 3 or RetroN 5. But unlike something like the RetroN 5, these are not emulation. They are system-on-a-chip consoles, so it's actually playing the game from your cartridge. The HD outputs in 720p and is actual HD hardware, so without forking out tons of money for modding your system or buying a much more expensive clone console, you are getting great picture at a great price. Now the video, color, and sound won't be dead on exactly 100% for every single game you play. But that's just part of the trade-off with playing on a clone console, and will really only be noticeable if you know these games through and through, inside out. It's not going to affect the way they play, and it's definitely not going to affect how much fun you get out of them. Now, one of my favorite things about these consoles are the controllers. Hyperkin makes some great clone controllers, and both of these come with a Cadet, which is Hyperkin's NES controller.
These have the exact same button layout as your classic NES controller, and they feel fantastic. They also have these little cutaways on the corner, which matches with Hyperkin's design aesthetic. But it also makes them a whole lot more comfortable to hold for long play sessions. You don't have the corners cutting into your fingers. You also have these little bulges on the underside, which makes it quite a bit more ergonomic. Now the RetroN 1 HD's Cadet comes with a 10-foot cable. That is awesome. Hyperkin usually does a great job at giving you plenty of length on the controllers. Now the AV's Cadet isn't quite as long. I'd say it's about 3 or 4 feet, which is still plenty serviceable. In my opinion, it's just another take in the HD's favor. Now the AV does run a little bit cheaper, but in the end, it is all up to personal preference. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.
What is up, everybody? Joey from Nostalgic here, coming at you with a product feature of the Hyperkin RetroN Sq. This is the version 1.2 firmware update. We're gonna crack this open, do an unboxing for you, and give you an objective overview. First things first, these are available in 2 different colors. There is a black and gold, and their Hyper Beach color. Today we will be looking at the Hyper Beach color, but I did want to show you this black and gold one. That looks real classy. But yeah, this is the same Hyper Beach color as the RetroN 5, and they also have a RetroN 1 and some controllers in this color. The difference with this being that it is translucent. I love the translucent plastic. I miss when companies would make things look edible. But yeah, this thing just looks like a gelatinous cube of just gelatin, some gummy that I could eat. But yeah, for those of you who are unaware of what the RetroN Sq is, this is an HD console that you can plug into your TV to play your Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games. Now here it does say Game Boy Advance is in beta, but that is what the version 1.2 firmware update is for. The original firmware for this, the Game Boy Advance performance was a bit spotty. It had low frame rate, it was pretty clunky, but as we will see, most of that has been fixed with this release. Very happy about that. Pretty much the only other options for playing, especially Game Boy Advance games on your TV, you had the Super Game Boy for the Super Nintendo, and that played Game Boy games. You had the Super Game Boy 2 that was released only in Japan, and then there was the Game Boy Player on the GameCube, and now those are very expensive, the Game Boy Player, especially hard to find the disc that goes with it, and there were some problems, there's some input lag and everything. So the way to get to the best experience playing a Game Boy Advance game on your TV was third-party consoles. You've got the RetroN 5, which plays NES, SNES, Famicom, Super Famicom, Genesis, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance. That RetroN 5 is the whole package. That plays Game Boy Advance perfectly. And then there are other third-party options such as the Game Boy Consolizer, but those are a lot more on the tech end of things. You know, you disassemble your own Game Boy Advance and solder all the connections, and you get this cool, you know, Frankenstein monster looking console that plugs into your TV. This, on the other hand, is a complete out-of-the-box console, and Hyperkin has done a really good job with releasing these products that feel like complete packages. This feels like a console. It doesn't feel like a motherboard in a plastic shell, as a lot of old third-party companies used to be. We are a long way from the days of Mad Cats. So without further ado, let's crack into this thing and see exactly what you get. So when you first open it up here, you get a card, play well, thank you for your purchase and support. We love you, Hyperkin. And then we get a little Hyperkin sticker. That is always nice. I always love getting stickers. You get the RetroN Sq instruction manual. I'm not sure if I would call it a manual. It is an accordion of death with tons of different languages. And then in here we've got 2 boxes branded with the RetroN Sq, and then the console itself. So pulling out the console here, you got this sweet gelatin cube with that awesome Hyper Beach color, with that sort of teal blue and those pink buttons. I love the way that looks. It's got a real nice retro feel, and it really pops on a shelf. The form factor of this console is really nice. It's just a nice handful that you just grab and go with. And like I said, Hyperkin's done such a great job at making these feel like consoles. So in this first larger box here, you open it up and you get an exclusive Hyperkin Scout. So this is a Super Nintendo controller. It is their
third-party Super Nintendo controller. This one is a USB input as opposed to an actual Super Nintendo or Super Nintendo Mini connection. So that is exclusive to this, as well as this exclusive translucent Hyper Beach color. The only way to get this is with the RetroN Sq. They do sell additional USB Super Nintendo Scouts on their website, but they are gray color. So I really like these controllers. The Scout is probably my favorite third-party Super Nintendo clone. All the buttons feel great, and you got nice chunky start and select buttons, and these are nice and responsive. And what is really great is that this comes with a 10-foot cord, which is really nice considering that this console weighs, probably less than a pound, and sitting on a shelf, if you've got a short cable, you're just going to yank that right off the shelf. So having a 10-foot cable is fantastic with this console. Along with that controller, you also get an HDMI cable. And then in the other smaller box, if I can open it, you get your USB-C cable. I'm not sure how long this is, but it is a sizable cable. It'll get you a nice length to fit on your shelf or entertainment system. So it's just a standard USB-C, and it also comes with a power supply. I really appreciate when companies throw these in. The Superboy did not come with one of these for charging, so it's nice to have this here, especially since this is not a handheld and doesn't charge. It needs to be plugged into a wall to work. So it's nice being able to not have to hunt down some spare phone brick to get this puppy hooked up. So besides a styrofoam spacer, that is all you've got in the box. And that is everything you need to plug this in and start playing. So going over the specifics of the console here, you have this cool cube with these rounded edges, and then the one slant edge here that has the Hyperkin logo, and that lights up when the console turns on. Looks really pretty, especially with this translucent plastic. It really lights it up. You've got your power and reset buttons on the front here, as well as your controller USB port. Now there's only one controller port, and that's because most Game Boy and Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance games are all just one player. Something I did try and test out was running this through the paces of trying to get it to work with a Game Boy Link cable and playing a two-player game. I tested it with Zelda 4 Swords. Doesn't really work. For playing on a TV, you're likely just playing by yourself or handing the controller to a buddy. So, having one controller port isn't a huge downside. On the sides, you've got these sort of plastic stoppers here and these rubber feet on the bottom that keep it nice and firm. It ain't going anywhere unless if you pull it or push it. Like I said, it is quite light. On the back here, we've got your USB-C power. We've got the HDMI out. And we've got a switch here that switches between 4:3 and 16:9 aspect ratio. That's really nice, especially considering the aspect ratio of original Game Boy and Game Boy Color games is different from Game Boy Advance games. As well on the back here, you have your memory card slot with a micro SD with 520 MB on it. This is what's got the firmware on it, so you want to make sure that is plugged in at all times. I'm not quite sure how modding has gone on this, but something to note is that this is an open source firmware. They supported fans messing around with the firmware, and actually they are the ones who got the Game Boy Advance running, and Hyperkin updated it, and now Game Boy Advance is running perfectly. The original release of these, like I said, the Game Boy Advance didn't run too great on, but it's really nice to see a company recognize what the fans have done and start actually shipping it with that full version 1.2 firmware. So besides that, the controller is your standard Super Nintendo controller. You've got your nice D-pad here, your chunky select and start buttons. You got your A, B, X, and Y buttons, and your left and right shoulder. Game Boy games only need an A and B, so your X and Y is a little superfluous, but it always feels nice playing the Game Boy games with a Super Nintendo controller. It feels nostalgic, it feels right, and these Scouts fit in your hand really nice, especially for me. I have trouble finding controllers that are ergonomic. I hate Joy-Cons. God, I hate Joy-Cons. But this controller is fantastic. And especially considering the Super Game Boy on the Super Nintendo, it feels right. It's at home playing on a Super Nintendo controller. So I'm glad they packed in the Scout. In these instruction booklets, it just goes over the layout, where everything is on the console, the aspect ratio, the memory card, and how to set up your RetroN Sq. Everything is really straightforward on this as compared to the RetroN 5, which has a pretty extensive menu. This has no menu. It is just an emulator, you plug in your games and you go. The downside to that is that all original Game Boy games already have a color filter applied to them, similar to how the Super Game Boy did. But as opposed to the Super Game Boy, there's no customizability to that color palette. So that is something that is a little disappointing. I'm of the crowd that enjoys playing original Game Boy games in black and white or in shades of green. It feels right to me. So that is something to note with this. But Game Boy Color games and Game Boy Advance games play just as they were made. Something I really like on the form factor of this console, I don't know why, but the edge here in the cartridge slot is beveled. It's just a nice little slot, and it just slides right into that cartridge slot. I don't know why that makes it feel nice to me, but I really do like it. The design of this is very nice. Yeah, so that's everything you get out of the box, but I know what you guys are here. You want to see some games being played on this, so let's hook it up to the TV and check it out. So let's go ahead and start off with the classic Super Mario Land. So when you start this up, you're greeted with the Hyperkin logo, as well as a loading screen. But what's interesting is that this console is an emulator, so it essentially rips a ROM of the game off the cartridge and saves it onto the SD card of the console. So once you play a game once, you won't have to sit through that loading screen again. So we'll go ahead and switch this to original 4:3 aspect ratio. So everything looks great. It's nice and crisp. Plays just like it did on the Game Boy. And something that I really appreciate is the sound. It sounds perfect, nice and crisp, good audio quality, and I just died. So there's the loading screen. Let's play some Tetris. So you can see here that the aspect ratio problem from the original release has been fixed. 4:3 now is true 4:3. It isn't stretched like it was on the original release. So you can see these are perfect squares. This was an issue I was unaware was fixed. I knew about the Game Boy Advance one, but I didn't know that this had been fixed. So that is very nice that you can play these in the true proper aspect ratio. That is something that usually bothers me when these pixels get stretched and the models just look a little wonky. So it's nice to have that corrected. I'm gonna be careful, I'm gonna be stuck here playing Tetris all day.
One eternity later.
So on the Game Boy Color side of things, let's test it with a little bit of Donkey Kong Country. Yeah, sometimes these loading screens take a little longer than others, but you got a nice little hippo to look at. So I'll be real, some of these Game Boy Color games, they don't quite have the same novelty effect as the original Game Boy games do. it just kind of hurts my eyes to look at these Game Boy Color games on such a big screen. Just the absolute mishmash of color here. But they play just fine. Oh, I'm a rhino now. Yeah, these maps look rough. That's no fault of the RetroN Sq. Oh, now I'm Diddy. So moving right along, we've got Tony Hawk Pro Skater here. I was interested to see how this one plays. We gotta go with Tony. So now on to the main event here, the Game Boy Advance. These do take a little bit longer to load, but we're going to start off here with Metroid Zero Mission. So yeah, we can swap between this aspect ratio and this one. This one's a little bit stretched, and this one is how the Game Boy Advance originally had it. Look how crisp that looks. Man, just look at that. My ball. Yeah, so Zero Mission plays fantastic. Just look at this. Really don't have any issues at all here. The first version of the firmware here had, first off, pretty bad frame rate issues, but it also was just a little soft, a little fuzzy. So it's nice to see that that has been corrected here. And now we've got Legend of Zelda Four Swords. Just gonna play some Link to the Past here. Heck yeah, look at that. Whee! So yeah, cross-playing, I've played a good while of Link to the Past on here, but apparently I didn't save. And I've played a chunk of Zero Mission. I've really encountered no real bugs or glitches, any stuttering or tearing or anything. Everything's looked really clean. So yeah, look at that map. It's a little trippy, but that's kind of how it was on the original Game Boy Advance and Super Nintendo. It was, oof. Trying to get that sort of isometric angle there. Yeah, all the colors pop and the pixels are nice and sharp. It looks gorgeous. So yeah, I'll show this to you in the two different aspect ratios. So this is the set to 4:3. It is the standard Game Boy Advance. Here is the 16:9. This is the full sort of standard aspect ratio most TVs nowadays. It's just a little stretched with the Game Boy Advance that isn't quite as noticeable as it is with the original Game Boy. But it's nice that you've got the option here to play in those two different aspect ratios. Whoa! Ah! This guy always scared me as a kid. Oh! Let's go! So another thing I wanted to point out is that this does work with indie and homebrew games. So here is Dadius. This is a really cool indie game by Spacebot. It's a cool indie horror game here that's kind of got the Pokemon gameplay. Thanks, Mom. Hail Dadius. So yeah, that's pretty much it for the RetroN Sq, a neat, compact little system from the guys over at Hyperkin. It's really nice to see this finally sort of reach its full potential. Hyperkin has sort of redeemed themselves. When this first released, the Game Boy Advance function was objectively pretty broken. So it's really nice to now have a way to play Game Boy Advance games on your TV that won't break the bank. And it's really nice that you are able to get an exclusive controller. So overall, my experience with the RetroN Sq has been very positive, and I would suggest it to people. I'm a huge sucker for form factor in this translucent plastic and this Hyper Beach color in particular. So I really, really am glad that Hyperkin has stuck with this product and made it what it was intended to be. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed, and happy gaming.
The Sega Genesis brought some heat. We've got all the Sonic games Contra Hardcore, Mortal Kombat with blood and guts, and my personal favorite version of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Tournament Fighters with playable Casey Jones. Sega was counterculture in the 90s. If you liked blood and guts and real looking guns, you got a Sega Genesis, not some baby Super Nintendo. Papa Miyamoto, please forgive me, I said that in the heat of comedy and I did not mean it. I love the Super Nintendo just as much as every other gamer on this planet. Please have mercy on my soul. Well, Genesis is pretty cool, though. If you don't have a way to play Sega Genesis games in the year of our Lord 2022, then what the hell are you doing? Genesises, or Genesai, or Genesises, they're relatively easy to come by, and they're really not all that expensive. But they are approaching 30 years old, and there are 3 distinct models of them. Finding ones that work, are in good condition, and will last you a while without breaking down, are getting harder and harder to find. I also have this whack-ass AV port, so getting these to play on a modern HD TV requires you to spend more money on cables, adapters, upscalers. You know, you gotta deal with all the bit crunching and all the caveats that upscaling your retro consoles comes with. But I've got a solution. This is the Mega RetroN HD from Hyperkin. There's another one of Hyperkin's clone consoles, and it does exactly what you think. Plays Sega Genesis games. But it also plays Mega Drive games, the PAL and Japanese version of the Sega Genesis. But before we jump into it, this video is not sponsored by Hyperkin. We purchased these ourselves wholesale from our store Nostalgic Video Games. The purpose of these videos is to give you an objective overview of these third-party products, since most of them really aren't on a lot of people's radar. If I answer any of your questions, make sure to let me know, and if you have any questions that I didn't answer, absolutely leave a comment below and I will try and answer those in the comments for you. But if you do want to support us, there is a link in the description below to our Redbubble store that's got shirts, stickers, posters, mugs, pet bandanas, shower curtains, woodblock prints. Awesome. So if you like our content and want to show us your support, pick something up from that Redbubble store. In the description, there's also a link to our Discord server. And if you get something from a Redbubble, please post a picture of it in the Discord server because I would love to see it. Now let's jump into this thing. Inside the box, you get the console itself, which is a nice, sleek, Genesis-esque looking box. It's got that little cut corner with the Hyperkin logo like all their consoles have, and it's got the trademark Genesis circle on the top. You've got your on and off switch up here, looks and feels really nice. You've got a reset button right here, and you've got 2 of your 6-pin controller ports. Around on the back, you have a micro USB port for power, which this comes with a 6-foot micro USB cable as well as a USB adapter, which is awesome because more and more nowadays we are seeing companies not bother to throw in the little USB to wall adapters, and it really bugs the hell out of me. You also have an HD output as well as AV ports if you prefer that classic feel. And the last thing on the back here is a 16:9 and 4:3 aspect ratio switch.
Nice to have those. I prefer playing in the original 4x3 because stretching those pixels looks horrible, and this thing feels hefty. Hyperkin does a great job at making their consoles and controllers feel premium. You also get the Hyperkin Sq, which is their 6-button Sega Genesis clone, and just like all other Hyperkin controllers, I really do like this one. The buttons feel a little chunkier than some of the other controllers from Hyperkin, but they do break in once you play with them. I have a feeling that probably has something to do with the material they use for the rubber membranes under the actual button caps themselves. But just like with every other third-party controller, the materials used to make this controller are different from the original manufacturer's materials, so they are going to feel a little different. But in my experience, Hyperkin has some of the best quality third-party controllers that work on original and clone systems with slight aesthetic upgrades that still don't destroy the look and feel of the original controller. The Sq also has a 10-foot cable, so you've got plenty of room and you don't have to deal with the dreaded classic console syndrome. Continuing on with differences between this and the Sega Genesis Classic console, this plays your original cartridges. It does not have any games preloaded onto it. Personally, I prefer that. I love collecting games and having the piece of history on my shelf and in my collection. But if you prefer digital games or having everything just already pre-installed on a box, check out a Sega Genesis Classic console. Now on the back of the console here, there's a little switch with 3 options: NTSC-J, NTSC-U, and PAL. Those are Japanese, United States, and European games. So besides outputting an actual 720p HD, the other huge draw of this is that you can play games from other regions. A lot of really expensive games out there are much cheaper to buy PAL or Japanese versions of. So if you want to play a game and it happens to be crazy expensive in NTSC-U, you can pick up a Japanese or PAL version, it'll play just fine on this console. But it is important to note that this is just a system-on-a-chip console. There's no SD port or any sort of operating system, so there's no way to upload language patches to Japanese games. If you want to do that, you'll have to check out RetroN's higher-end console, the RetroN 5, which plays all of the Genesis games that this does, as well as NES, SNES, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance, and all of the Japanese and European versions of those cartridges. Prices on retro consoles are shifting all the time, but at Nostalgic, these are really about the same price as a standard Sega Genesis. Now, as with every clone console, the video and audio output of this is not going to be 100% exactly the same as the original. Criminy! There's a ghost.
Did you see that? Over Joey's left shoulder, the Brawler 64 controller drops from its place on the shelf, unprovoked. Was this just vibrations through the wall from the Dairy Queen next to us in the plaza? Or was it something else?
The major difference with this to me. But the differences are negligible, and compared to that of using upscalers and converters, you're going to get very similar results. But if you are an enthusiast, maybe this console isn't for you. If you're willing to put the time and money into getting an original console and having the best setup you can, more power to you. We've got options for you as well at Nostalgic Video Games, so check out some of our other videos. All in all, I really like Hyperkin's clone consoles. Yeah, there are some trade-offs to using original hardware, but for the casual gamer, these are fantastic budget options to get playing on your HD TV. If you want to show your kids the games you grew up playing, or if you're just feeling a little nostalgic. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. If you're like us, you got a box of old 2600 cartridges just rotting in an attic or a basement, or maybe your kids are just too preoccupied catfishing pedophiles on Roblox or leaving troll messages in Elden Ring to care about Pong. But there are some classics in here that still deserve to be played today. Wizard of War, Missile Command, Spider-Man is awesome, and the biggest trouble nowadays with Atari consoles is finding one that works. These puppies are now 45 years old. Not only is the hardware in these things starting to give out, but technology nowadays has just surpassed coax inputs and RF switch boxes with exposed contacts that you have to screw in. And that, my friends, is where the good old folks at Hyperkin come in. The RetroN 77 is a modern clone or emulator console that actually plays your original 2600 cartridges. Not only does it have a really cool art deco that's consistent with all of Hyperkin's other consoles, but it also has a lot of quality of life changes as well as being HDMI out. That's awesome. Now you can upscale those beautiful 8-bit pixels into glorious 720p with a 16:9 aspect ratio. Or not, because stretching these games kind of makes me want to throw up. Now first things first, out of the box, you get the console itself. Now this is the new Amber version. There was a release that was sort of the classic black and wood grain style, just like the original 2600. But this is the most recent new release, and I gotta say, I really do like the look of this thing. I love translucent colored plastic. If something looks like a gummy and makes me want to eat it, then I'm that much more likely to buy it. It's got this cool sort of dark and light blue design going on. It looks real retro and really nice. Now beside the console, you also get Hyperkin's Trooper, which is their Atari clone joystick. This is probably the most important quality of life change besides that HDMI out. Now this controller, compared to the original Atari controller here, now this controller has made a few significant changes. The original Atari controller was pretty notorious for sort of digging into your hands here. Hyperkin have sort of shaved off the edges here, so it feels really nice and is a lot more comfortable to play long term. It also has 2 buttons. They both do the same thing, but it's there so it is interchangeable for right-handed and left-handed players. So you have the option of which way you want to hold this, which is really, really nice. It also continues that amber style with these baby blue buttons and that blue deco. Looks really, really cool. And the build quality on this thing is fantastic. The controller is also still the original Atari Genesis port. So on the front, you can actually use your original Atari controllers with this if you would like. Note to self, also test a Genesis controller on this. Besides these, you also get the standard, thank you for your support and purchase and Hyperkin sticker. You get your instruction manual, black and white, but it's got your layout and how to set up and just to use this console in general. It also has a whole section on homebrew games, which I don't have any to show you, but they do work on here and there is support on the RetroN 77 for those, so that is awesome. I'm glad that it's actually a booklet, not one of those accordion things, because I hate those. You also get a micro USB cable and a power supply, which is always great. I love getting those wall converters so you don't have to hunt one down. And the last thing you get in here is the HDMI cable if you need one. The length on this HDMI cable isn't too great. I think that's like, I don't know, 2-3 feet, which is shorter than the micro USB cable and much shorter than the controller cable. The controller actually has a 10-foot cable, which is awesome. I love having that option, especially when you don't have a wireless controller, to be able to, sit back a little further and enjoy your games from a more comfortable position. But the HDMI cable, it's a little short, which kind of stinks, but it serves its purpose, and most people will already have an HDMI cable plugged up to their TV somewhere, so it is nice that you do get one. So that is everything you get with the RetroN 77 in the box, but I know why you're here, and what I'm excited for is to get some games playing on this thing. Let's check them out. So here we've got the 77 all set up and ready to roll here. We're going to start off with the all-time classic, Asteroids. So right off the bat here, we get to see my biggest pet peeve about this console, and that is that it boots up in 16:9. And that aspect ratio switch button is on the back of the console. So you have to reach around back there and switch it to that 4:3. I really do not like the way it looks stretched, but I guess I understand most TVs nowadays are a 16:9 aspect ratio, and that is what a lot of people will expect to see, so it's nice to have the option, but I do wish that switch was on the front. It would be a whole lot easier. I stink at this game, so nobody make fun of me. But yeah, the game boots up. The controller feels fantastic. It's really nice having that option of the 2 buttons. The stick feels great. There's really no drift or stiffness to it. It's really responsive and feels really good, which is nice because a lot of original controllers for the Atari have worn out over time and just don't feel too great anymore. Oh, scared me. Yeah, seeing these games playing in 720p, it's really, really crisp. There's really no fuzzy edges or anything. Everything looks great, as great as it can for the Atari. Pitfall. Yeet. Oh my god. Oh my god. I died. Okay. We got the snake. Ooh. Oh. Booby trap. Oh, I fell for the booby trap. Spider-Man. Label is gnarly, but this is one of my personal favorites on the system, Spider-Man. Oh, Spider-Man foam thing died. So yeah, the mechanic's kind of weird. You just sort of whip around and like kick criminals in the head, but like you can't web onto the windows. You can only like hit the criminals with your feet, and you can't hit them with your web because it'll like cut the web or oh my god. It's fun, but it is vastly infuriating. The green goober. Spider-Man! He's goobing. No, 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 no. No, 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 no. Here's a game that has become one of my favorites. I'd played the arcade before, but I'd never played the Atari port. I don't know if it's supposed to be this flickery, but Wizard of War. It's like Pac-Man, but with guns. Or I guess wands, because you're a wizard. I don't know. I don't know if these are like monkeys or like dinosaurs. That's definitely a dinosaur. It's definitely not supposed to be this flickery. This is painful. What the hell? Oh. I think this game's just trying to put me into an epileptic seizure.
All right, what now?
Just so you all know, this is the 4th time I've played ET today. Due to various technical difficulties, recording not saving, audio not working. So yeah, my will to live is steeply declining. Oh god, these holes. You know, like I knew the story. I've seen the documentary. I just always kind of thought this game was like really not all that bad. Oh, let me go. Oh my god. I just thought, oh, Inspector Gadget. I just thought this game was like an old shitty game that like really wasn't all that bad, but just everyone sort of focused their energy on. But no, it really is that bad. Nothing makes sense. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. The mechanics aren't fair or fun. Oh my god. I don't even look like E.T. Like what is that? Oh my god. And I fall right back down in the hole. Come on. Get me out. And I'm back down in the hole. Come on. And I'm down in the hole again. Oh my god, how do I... There's like... How do I get out? Oh my god. No. No. Oh my god. Okay. Okay. Just breathe, it'll all be over soon. Checking and making sure the camera is recording. Yeah, that's it. That's it. That's enough ET. Something cool to note about this system compared to some other just Hyperkin clone systems is that it does actually boot into a menu if you open it with no cartridge. So it's got your license, and there's actually a handful of preloaded games here on that micro SD, as well as just an option for the cartridge. So I can't get Baby to work, but Muncher 71, this one's a pretty solid game. It's cool having some preloaded games on here, and this is from 2013, so that's pretty recent in terms of Atari games. So you're just trying to munch everything and not get munched. So here's Astron Tilde 1, or Astronomer 2018. So this one, you just kind of have like this radar thing. You just gotta like scan the star or asteroid or something. You just kind of gotta keep it on it while holding down the button. If it wasn't for the god-awful sound of the 2600, this would be a pretty relaxing game. It doesn't like you scanning the asteroids, that destroys all your progress on scanning the star. Oh my god, this game's frustrating. And then there's this one, Nexion. Nexion 3D. Yeah, I just don't get this one. Like, I move the stick and like some things jiggle around. There's like a little guy there that if I hold down and press the fire button, it fires. And he does a little shoot. No, I just don't get it. I'm like, why is it Nexion 3D? Is it supposed to be 3D? Like, I don't get it. What the heck? Oh, what was that? Oh my god, Herobrine. Yeah, I don't get it. And then the last game on here is Baby. And it starts up, just says Baby. And I hit the thing and it says paused. And I like try to, I hit the buttons, I hit reset. Nothing happens. I hit mode and it just gives me a seizure. And I hit fry. And it breaks the game. So yeah, that's pretty much it for the RetroN 77 from Hyperkin. Yeah, so despite some of the compatibility issues with some relatively high profile games, this is a great way to get some of your classics running on your HD TV. The ease of use and overall quality of life improvements over using an original 2600 make this a really fantastic alternative for anybody who just wants to play their games or wants something a little bit more reliable. Or if you're like me, you just think it looks cool as hell. So yeah, if you enjoyed, like, subscribe, hit the bell icon. So yeah, thanks for watching, and in the meantime, I'm gonna... Help me.
Thanks for watching. If you watched this whole thing, then oh my god, you're a trooper and I love you. Let's forget about that RetroN Sq video. I didn't really know what I was doing. Make sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you already own one of these, make sure to let me know what you think of them in the comments, or if you decided to pick one up after watching this video, absolutely let me know. I would love to hear your thoughts on these consoles. Thanks for tuning in to the Nostalgic Network, and I'll see you next time.